New Zealand consistently ranks among the countries with the highest quality of life in the world. It has a stable political system, a developed economy, and a natural environment that attracts tourists and millionaires alike. However, in recent years, it has begun to record one of the highest emigration rates among developed nations. More than 15% of its population now lives in Australia. The number 15 may not sound that high, but we are talking about 670,000 New Zealanders currently living in Australia. And most of them are not retirees or temporary migrants. They are young, skilled professionals of working age. This raises an uncomfortable question. How can a seemingly idyllic country be losing its most valuable people? To understand this, we need to look at how New Zealand's economy really works, and why its own strengths are beginning to work against it. From the outside, New Zealand looks like a model of an advanced society. It has solid institutions, low crime rates, high levels of education, functional public services, and landscapes that seem straight out of a fantasy movie. For many, it's the example of what a modern country should be, and yet something doesn't quite fit. Because while international metrics place it among the best places to live, a growing number of New Zealanders, especially young ones, are packing their bags and leaving. Not because they hate their country, quite the opposite. They leave despite loving it. This phenomenon poses a paradox that's hard to ignore. How can a country that meets so many positive indicators be losing qualified people on a sustained basis? The answer isn't an economic collapse or a political crisis. It's not a war or a natural disaster either. What's happening in New Zealand is subtler, but just as serious. A kind of dissonance between promise and reality. The promise of a calm, safe, stable life, and the reality of an economy that for many feels limited, static, and without enough room to grow. Most of those who leave don't do it out of desperation, but out of ambition. They want to move forward, climb, compete, access dynamic industries, and they feel that in their home country that isn't always possible. This doesn't mean New Zealand is in decline. It means that its current system, however well it works in some respects, doesn't provide enough pathways for everyone. And this is especially true when it comes to young, highly skilled talent. But why does this happen? Why can a modern, peaceful, well-educated, resource-rich country fail to keep its best minds? To understand it, you have to look past the postcard and see how its economy actually works. And that's where the first big problem appears: its size. New Zealand is not only beautiful, it is also remote. More than 2,000 kilometers away from the nearest developed country, isolated in the middle of the Pacific, with a population of just 5 million people, fewer than the city of Sydney. This isolation has shaped its economy in ways that are not always visible from the outside. And this is where we begin to understand why so many young people decide to leave. Scale is everything in economics. A nation's ability to compete globally is directly related to the size of its internal market, its logistical connectivity, and its access to international supply chains. And in this, New Zealand starts with a clear disadvantage. Producing locally can be efficient in some sectors, but mass export and industrialization depend on proximity to key ports, trade routes, and business density. New Zealand lacks all three. Moreover, its logistical costs are considerably higher for obvious geographical reasons. This is not just an obstacle for manufacturing. It also limits the development of technological, scientific, financial, or creative industries. If an entrepreneur wants to scale a digital business, open offices, secure investment, or find specialized talent, they are most likely to end up looking towards Sydney, Melbourne, or Singapore. And what happens when a country loses its best entrepreneurs, technicians, and engineers? It loses innovation capacity, and with it, it loses future opportunities. This is not about poor management, but about a structural limitation. A small market does not justify large investments. A remote country is not attractive for regional headquarters. And this causes many companies to end up seeing New Zealand as a stopover, not a strategic destination. This creates a second effect: the concentration of industries in sectors that do need to operate locally, such as tourism, agriculture, or certain internal services. But those sectors, although valuable, cannot absorb the available talent, especially young, urban, and skilled talent. And when the economy does not offer a diversity of paths, career trajectories narrow. A graduate in data science, biotechnology, or artificial intelligence has few options to fully develop within the country. And in the face of this, the decision to emigrate stops being emotional and becomes logical. Even for those who want to start their own business, The lack of a robust investment ecosystem, accelerators, and networking means that big ideas must seek wings outside the nest. New Zealand is a country that has done a lot with very little, but in today's global economy, very little doesn't always cut it. And this silent disadvantage begins to explain why so many decide to leave, even if they love the place where they were born. When an economy cannot scale in high-value industries or compete in global strategic sectors, it often turns inward. In the case of New Zealand, this inward turn has a name and surname: the real estate market. In this country, buying, selling, financing, renting, or building housing accounts for about half of all economic activity. An outsized proportion, even compared to other developed economies. And this dependency has structural consequences. When much of economic growth is supported by the value of urban land, incentives become distorted. Capital flows into speculation rather than productivity. Talent is directed toward construction, real estate, or the mortgage finance sector, rather than toward technology, science, or creative industries. And access to housing inevitably becomes a privilege that is increasingly difficult to attain. Over the last 2 decades, housing prices in New Zealand have grown much faster than wages. In cities like Auckland or Wellington, an average apartment can cost more than 10 times the average annual income. This places New Zealand among the countries with the greatest housing income imbalance in the world. So, how does the system respond to this bubble? With well-intentioned but insufficient measures. In 2018, the government banned non-resident foreigners from buying properties. But this measure had little real impact. Foreign buyers represented a small fraction of the market, and Australians, who dominated that segment, were exempt under bilateral agreements. Meanwhile, prices continued to rise. Urban land shortages, slow bureaucratic processes, speculation on unbuilt plans, and the use of housing as a financial asset all fed a perfect storm. This doesn't just affect first-time homebuyers. It also limits social mobility. Renting is expensive, and buying is practically impossible for young professionals, even with education and stable jobs. This is where the real estate market stops being just an economic issue and becomes a migratory force. If working and saving for years doesn't even get you a down payment, but that same work pays more in Australia, what's the logic of staying? Housing is not just a roof. It is access, opportunity, a life project. And when that project is unfeasible, citizens don't rebel. They simply leave. Moreover, those who do manage to buy become trapped, not just by debt, but by a lack of flexibility. Changing cities, taking risks, starting a business, all of that becomes harder when a mortgage consumes 40 or 50% of your income. And the country consequently loses dynamism. It loses talent, it loses innovation, it loses momentum. New Zealand is not the only country caught in this cycle, but few have allowed real estate to become the economic heart of their nation. Unless growth engines are diversified, unless viable alternatives are created for younger generations to project themselves within the country, the real estate market will not only remain a bubble, it will become a constant expeller of citizens. In any country, migration is always a complex phenomenon, but in New Zealand, it has become a constant that can no longer be ignored. Currently, more than 670,000 New Zealand citizens reside in Australia. That's more than 15% of the country's total population, and it's not a temporary migration. Many do not return. They form new lives, establish themselves professionally, and raise families outside the country where they were born. This is not a new phenomenon. Moreover, there's another, less visible factor: social expectation. Many young people grow up knowing that going to Australia is part of the journey. It's not a failure or an exile. It's a natural progression. It's passed down as a tacit logic. If you want to move forward, you have to leave. And when migration becomes the expected path, no internal policy can easily compete with that. The effects are already being felt. There's a shortage of workers in key sectors: healthcare, technology, engineering, education. The pressure on the local system intensifies, and to compensate, the country increasingly turns to immigration, which poses new challenges that we'll explore in the next chapter. But there's an even deeper layer. The question isn't just why they leave, but why they don't return. And here, factors like higher wages, better career paths, or even a lifestyle more connected to the world come into play. New Zealand isn't losing an economic battle. It's losing a generation, a silent but devastating brain drain. To fill the gaps left by emigration, New Zealand has opted for an increasingly common solution in developed countries, attracting skilled immigration. At first glance, this seems logical. If doctors, engineers, technicians, or programmers are leaving, why not bring in new professionals from abroad? And indeed, the country has designed one of the most efficient and attractive immigration systems in the world. The process is fast, transparent, and focused on filling sectors with critical demand. But this, far from being a definitive solution, has opened a new Pandora's box. The first dilemma is strategic. What happens when the newcomers also leave? Once they obtain residency or citizenship, many immigrants do the same thing that New Zealanders do. They leave for Australia. Because yes, the Trans-Tasman Agreement that allows Kiwis to live and work freely in Australia also applies to many naturalized immigrants. New Zealand, unintentionally, is training and certifying talent that then crosses the sea to contribute to the growth of another country. This has generated an uncomfortable perception. New Zealand as a stepping stone, not as a final destination. And that comes with direct costs. The state invests in welcoming, training, integrating, and providing public services to these people. But if they leave just as they begin to be fiscally productive, that investment is not recovered. Moreover, the constant influx of new residents increases the pressure on a system that was already under strain. Housing, healthcare, education, transportation, everything becomes more scarce and more expensive. This feeds the internal narrative that immigrants worsen the situation, although the data often doesn't support this idea. But the most delicate issue isn't the economic pressure, it's the structural impact. Many immigrants take on low-paying jobs in sectors where there is not enough local labor: hospitality, agriculture, cleaning, construction. These are essential jobs, but with few pathways for advancement. This can generate cycles of poverty and partial integration. Additionally, if a country becomes accustomed to importing labor without increasing its added value, it risks perpetuating an economy stagnant in productivity. And then arises a question that cuts like a scalpel. Is New Zealand losing its ability to generate and retain a middle class? The paradox is brutal. It exports skilled human capital and imports vulnerable labor, a gap that widens every year. But the most dangerous thing isn't what leaves or what arrives. It's what transforms in between. Can a small, remote country dependent on its internal stability withstand a model that is eroding from within? Or is New Zealand, without realizing it, building the conditions for its own imbalance? The answer lies in what's coming, because the future ahead looks nothing like the past that worked for them. New Zealand's economy has remained stable for years thanks to a combination of factors: good management, strong international relations, and a positive global image. But now, that balance, once admired from the outside, is starting to show cracks. One of the most obvious is the aging population. The proportion of elderly adults grows year after year, while the generational replacement is limited by the constant brain drain of young professionals. This directly puts pressure on three key pillars: pensions, public healthcare, and the workforce. And when there aren't enough young people to sustain the system, the entire model starts to falter. Even more concerning is the impact on foreign investment. Global companies are carefully monitoring where to expand. And when a country loses dynamism, productivity, or human capital, it becomes a riskier bet. Less investment means fewer jobs. Fewer jobs mean fewer opportunities. And fewer opportunities means more young people packing their bags. But it's not just an economic problem. It's also a problem of identity. For decades, New Zealand has been many things at once: a green paradise, an elite agricultural powerhouse, a model of social stability, a tourist destination, even a refuge for billionaires. But in a world that demands specialization and clear strategy, that diversity has become confusion. What does New Zealand aspire to be? Does it want to be the Silicon Valley of the Pacific? A climate retreat for the rich? A bastion of food sustainability? Today, the answer is unclear. And the lack of strategic direction, combined with a shrinking and aging population, could leave the country in a position of global irrelevance, especially if the current model persists: a speculative real estate market, a hyper-concentrated economy, and a constant brain drain. But, and this is key, there is still time. New Zealand still holds one of its most powerful assets: its national brand. it's still seen as a clean, safe, ethical, and advanced place. And in a polarized, polluted, and frantic world, that's an invaluable, intangible asset. What it needs is not a complete reinvention, but a reordering of its priorities. Encourage high-value sectors, foster research, support entrepreneurship, and yes, implement structural reforms in housing, transportation, and labor access. It's a long-term job, but if it doesn't start soon, it might soon be too late. Because if modern economic history teaches us anything, it's this: countries don't collapse overnight. They dissolve slowly. They lose their youth, their innovation, their drive, and when they try to react, it's already too late. New Zealand still has a future, but with every passing day, that future becomes a little more uncertain. And that could be the price of paradise. When we talk about ideal countries, New Zealand's name often tops the list. But behind its perfect postcards and global reputation, there's an uncomfortable reality, a country that can't keep its people. The mass emigration of young people, the weight of an under-diversified economy, and an aging population. These are signs of something deeper. A country can be beautiful, but if it doesn't offer real paths to progress, that charm becomes insufficient. Today, New Zealand stands at a crossroads. It can continue relying on its good image and stability, or it can make a conscious effort to reclaim its human capital and adapt to a rapidly changing world. But to do that, it must answer one essential question: who does this paradise want to be for? Because if its own citizens don't see themselves as part of the future, then the country isn't failing from the outside. It's failing from within. Now, don't leave me hanging on what you would do. Honestly, respond in the comments. What would you do if you lived in New Zealand? Subscribe to be part of this big family and hit the bell to stay updated for the next video. Have a great day.